No mai haere mai, welcome to our A Lot on Our Plates expert live panel. Thank you so much for joining us for the next hour. Ko Georgia Toka Wingawa. I'm the project lead for East Coast Life at the Boundary.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Jenny, research assistant for AF8, and with us running things behind the scenes is Alice Lake-Hammond, who's the AF8 program lead. Tonight, our panel will be answering the questions that you've sent to us over the last few weeks. Thank you very much to those who commented or messaged us. We've had a great response. We've grouped some questions together to help us get through more tonight, but if we don't get to yours, we will aim to follow up with them afterwards.
Cool. And we'd also like to give a huge thank you to our sponsors, the Earthquake Commission. They've made this event possible, as well as the A Lot on Our Plates campaign that we've been running over the past few weeks. So we'll start with just a brief introduction of our panel, of everyone who's here, and then we'll go straight into the questions.
Nice. So AF8 and East Coast Lab are incredibly fortunate to have such strong support from New Zealand's science and research community, and that really helps us plan and prepare for earthquakes and tsunami. So in no particular order, joining us tonight, we have Associate Professor Caroline Orchiston from the University of Otago. Caroline is the science leader for AF8, a co-lead of Resilience to Nature's Challenges Rural Resilience Program, and a member of the Quake core leadership team. Her research interests include natural hazards, societal resilience, and the tourism sector. Next up, Dr. Rob Langridge is an earthquake geologist from GNS Science. Rob's research is focused on the Alpine, Hope, and Wellington faults and is part of the 2016 Kaikoura Earthquake science response to the Papatea Fault. Then we have Dr. Kate Clark, who is an earthquake geologist from GNS Science with an interest in the geological records of earthquakes and tsunami that have impacted our coastline in the past. Kate's research is focused on both the Alpine Fault and the Hikurangi subduction zone.
All right, and we've also got Dr. William Power. So William is a geophysicist and a tsunami modeler from GNS with an interest in understanding the likelihood and consequences of tsunami for New Zealand. And also he also has a research interest focused in tsunami evacuation modeling. We also have Dr. Caroline Holden, who is a seismologist with an interest in understanding and mitigating the impact of earthquake shaking on the human and built environments. Her current research includes improved ground motion models for an Alpine Fault earthquake and the implementation of earthquake early warning systems in New Zealand. We also have Associate Professor William Witherspoon, who is from the University of Auckland's Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. His research is focused on improving the resilience of our infrastructure networks to natural hazard events. And Liam is the co-lead of Resilience to Nature's Challenges Built Environment Program and a principal investigator of the Quake Core Centre of Research Excellence in Seismic Resilience. And last but not least, we also have Professor Tom Wilson, who leads the University of Canterbury's Disaster Risk and Resilience Program and is also the Chief Science Advisor for NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency. Tom's research interests include understanding and mitigating the impacts of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions to infrastructure and primary industries. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for coming along to answer some of our audience's questions. So we'll crack right on.
First up, we have a question from Owen, who asks, the Alpine Fault is said to be straight. Exactly how straight is it? Within 50 metres, 200 metres, or a kilometre? Rob, you've carried out a lot of research along the Alpine Fault. How straight is it when you get up close?
Oh, sure. Well, I guess you could say as a primary observation, it's very easy to see when you look at the South Island as a whole that the Alpine Fault forms this amazingly straight boundary for hundreds and hundreds of kilometres, something like 400 kilometres. But as you say, when you get up in closer detail and you zoom in, and we do this quite a lot when we're doing basic active fault mapping, you can see there's quite a lot of complexities at various scales along the Alpine Fault. And in the last few years, we've had some advances that have come from new surveying techniques. There's one called LiDAR, which is similar in a way to radar. And LiDAR allows us to look at the ground, the geomorphology of the shape of the land underneath all that bush on the west coast. And we can see that there are bends in the faults and steps and little variations that mean that at scales, as you say, of sort of 50 meters to 200 meters, there's all sorts of complexities. And these can be important when it comes to understanding how future earthquake ruptures along the fault might work. Because we think when we look globally at faults that, that you need many kilometers in terms of a bend or a step in the fault to prevent an earthquake from propagating through and carrying on onto other faults. So it's important to be able to map the fault at varying scales, from the scales of sort of hundreds of kilometers right down to the scales of just a few meters on the ground. Yeah, thanks.
Kia ora, thanks, Rob. So the next question we have is from Phil, and it refers to the Hikarangi subduction zone. So he asks, does the east coast go up or down when that thing goes off? So I'll put this one to Kate. What have we learned from past events on the east coast of the North Island that can help us understand how that land is going to move in a Hikarangi subduction zone quake? Is it going to go up or down?
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. It really depends on whereabouts on the east coast. So generally parts of the coastline closer to the Hikarangi Trench will go up. So that's much of the Wairarapa coast from sort of Cape Turnagain down to Cape Palliser. Most of that area will go up, we expect. Large parts of Hawke's Bay are likely to go down. And then a lot of the Gisborne, sort of Tairawhiti coastline up to East Cape, that's likely to go up, but we're not too certain about that. The upper South Island, so parts of the Marlborough region, are likely to go down a little bit, not meters. Maybe from past events we've seen it go down anywhere between 30 centimetres to half a metre. And then around Wellington and the Kapiti coast, it's quite hard to tell. It could be quite variable. It's sort of on a hinge zone. It may go up a little bit or it may go down a little bit. It depends on the size of the earthquake.
You're muted, Jenny.
Sorry. Thanks, Kate. We also have a question about how an Alpine Fault earthquake could impact our coastal populations down here in the South Island. So Matt asks, what will be the impacts to major coastal population areas in New Zealand following an Alpine Fault quake? Caroline Augustin, what does the AF8 hazard scenario tell us about potential impacts to the South Island's coastal populations?
Yeah, Matt, that's a really, really great question. I would start by saying that when you're thinking about sort of coastlines, you know, dune areas, low-lying, sort of silty, sandy kind of sediments, like there's likely to be significant ground shaking that will generate liquefaction. So I think we all are familiar with what liquefaction is in terms of the ejection of fluid and sand out of the ground, and we saw a lot of that after the Christchurch earthquakes. And there are people on this call that are absolute experts in liquefaction. So if they want to talk more about that, then go ahead. I guess the other thing is, you know, we often think of coastlines and big earthquakes and we worry about tsunami. And with the Alpine Fault scenario that the AF8 science team put together a few years ago, tsunami wasn't one of the hazards that we were anticipating. And that's because the Alpine Fault is, for the most part, on land. It doesn't go offshore, off the coast until way down in Milford Sound. So there is potential for a localized tsunami event down in the Milford Sound area, which could impact Milford Sound itself. But in terms of the rest of the West Coast coastline, unlikely to generate a significant tsunami event. I'd probably bring in terms of other physical, you know, hazards generated by this earthquake, the sort of need to think about lake margins and rivers, because of course there are lots of alpine lakes around the West Coast, and we'd want to make sure that, again, people are aware of the need to move away from lake margins. There are two different things that could happen around lakes. Firstly, what's known as a seiche wave, which is essentially a sloshing effect where the lake margin sloshes with the movement of the ground motion. And the second one is the potential for a rockfall tsunami into a lake, which could generate quite a significant sort of rockfall tsunami event within lakes around the Southern Alps. I guess the other thing to think about are the sort of impacts and consequences on our communities, is the question actually asked. West Coast, anything that's sitting on liquefiable ground, for example, roads or bridges or buildings, are going to feel the effects of that. And so it's potential impacts on bridge approaches, the bridges themselves, and the ability then for this earthquake to isolate communities up and down the West Coast. So, unable, people not being able to cross bridges and get around the way we like to be able to get around. So the potential for isolation of communities on the West Coast is quite a significant thing. Yeah.
Cool, thanks, Carolyn. So that kind of flows on well to more conversation about tsunami. So we have a couple of questions related to tsunami evacuation. So Shane would like to know about inundation depths for Napier. So his question is, what is the anticipated inundation depth for the Napier area? So heading back to the Paraiti Hills, in a near source tsunami scenario, and how quickly might that depth be reached? So just wondering if the roof of a house would be an option, if there was time, if time was seriously limited, or there was severe land damage that would make getting to higher ground impossible. And then we have a similar question from Graham as well, who was also asking about that sort of vertical evacuation structure situation. So what is your opinion regarding the role of vertical evacuation structures in saving lives from tsunami? Do you believe that such structures are worthwhile and should be partially funded by the government? So I think we'll first go over to William. What do we need to know about potential inundation depths for the Napier area? And then maybe yourself and Liam as well. What are your thoughts on the use of vertical evacuation structures here in New Zealand?
Okay, well, thanks for the question. In terms of inundation depths for the Napier area, there really isn't one single answer, because it really depends a lot on the scenario. I mean, the particulars of the earthquake and the specifics of the location. So if you Google Hikarangi response plan, you'll see a report that we did some time ago where we modeled a few different magnitude 8.9 Hikarangi subduction zone earthquakes and looked at their inundations in Napier. And even for the same fault and the same magnitude, the specific details of the earthquake made quite a few differences to how far the inundation extended and what the depths were. In terms of how the inundation is distributed spatially, to look at a few of those typical scenarios of large Hikarangi earthquakes from that report, you might have a flow depth of perhaps 4 meters down by the port or Ahuriri on low-lying land. And then the flow depths tapers off as you sort of head back, some of those scenarios reaching the foothills. But, they're obviously getting, they're getting thinner and thinner in depth in generally as you head it further inland. In terms of the timing, in our models for Hikurangi subduction earthquakes, we're typically finding somewhere between 30 and 50 minutes to reach the peak of the first really significant waves. And that's time to reach the coast, and so there'll be a little bit of extra time for it to travel further inland. Although I would comment that sometimes there's some smaller waves that arrive earlier. So if you're really down by the coast, you want to get out as quickly as possible. There are also some other faults in Hawke's Bay that are a little bit closer to the coast than where the Hikurangi plate boundary comes to the surface. So those could also arrive a little bit earlier, but they also wouldn't unlikely to be as big a tsunami as from the Hikurangi subduction zone. In terms of evacuating to the roof of a house, for me personally, that would be very much the absolute last resort. So by far better, if at all possible, to get to high ground or go inland and get out of the tsunami evacuation zone. I wouldn't try to do that kind of evacuating to the roof of my house unless it was absolutely clear I had no alternatives. For instance, I could see the tsunami coming, and I had no time to do anything else. The reasons for that: remember that this is following a really big earthquake, so your house might not be as structurally sound as it normally is, for one thing. Another, if your house gets hit by the tsunami, even if you're above the water level, your house may move off its foundations or take damage. There may also be debris in the tsunami, so you might be above the water level, but if there is a boat or a container or some logs, you know, they may reach you even if you're above the water level. So that kind of thing, very much last resort. I think it's fair to say that there are some areas of the country where it is very difficult for people to evacuate on foot in the time that's required. It's very challenging. So some parts of southern Napier, also some areas of Petone, and investigating the possibility of vertical evacuation structures, which are purpose-built buildings or structures or designated tall, strong buildings for people to evacuate in, is definitely something to be considered in those places, in my opinion, where it's particularly challenging for people to evacuate otherwise. Those buildings would be tested against many different models to make sure that they were high enough with a good margin of safety and that they had good earthquake strength and would cope with the number of people going there. I'll also hand that question over to Liam to comment on that.
Thanks for that, William. I think William's done a pretty good job at covering most of the key aspects. I think the key things is an understanding of the loading, and particularly where we've got these events that we don't have much time to evacuate. Those are usually the ones that you're going to have quite significant shaking at the same time. So one of those key question marks is, how can we understand how our building will perform initially for an earthquake, and then following that from the sort of quite different characteristics that are loading that would come from a tsunami. And there's a fair few unknowns around that, and a lot of active research trying to understand for New Zealand building design, how do our sorts of designs perform when we see that sort of concurrent loading occurring. So I'd agree with William, if we can find a solution to be able to achieve that, then that's the way we want to go, but we need to first delve a bit more into those sorts of aspects, as well as aspects of how long will people have to be there, what are the foundation soils like. Caroline mentioned liquefaction. So unfortunately, we've also, in a lot of these areas, we've got that as an issue too. So if you've got quite difficult soils to deal with in terms of designing quite a big, probably heavy structure, those sort of work against each other a little bit when we're thinking about liquefaction and earthquake and tsunami. So plenty of active work in that space to try to find a solution.
Thanks, William and Liam. Super interesting. Our next question is from Simone, and she asks, is there any evidence of the Alpine Fault triggering other faults to the west of it, like the ones around the Paparoa Ranges and the one that's offshore from Westport? Rob, is there any evidence to suggest the Alpine Fault has triggered other faults to the west of it? Is it likely we could see an aftershock on one of these faults?
Yeah, it's a cool question. I'm going to give you a roundabout answer and say, if you were living in Bulla district in the 20th century, you would have experienced several really large earthquakes. Now, going back to 1929, there was a magnitude 7.8 earthquake on one of the major range-bounding faults in that region. And there were other big earthquakes, I think 1960 near Westport, and 1968 in the Ngangahua area as well. And what's kind of interesting about that series of earthquakes, I suppose, is that they're decades apart. But if you chose some other century going back through time, it probably is much, much more active in terms of earthquake release than most other centuries. If we were looking at trenching a fault or getting paleoseismic records, we probably would think the 20th century was a pretty active time in Bulla and Northwest Nelson. Now linking that in with your question, those three earthquakes are not particularly linked with any events on the Alpine Fault. So that's one sort of piece of good news in a way. What we are concerned about, I think, is that the Alpine Fault could rupture many hundreds of kilometers from, say, the south to the north. And what happens to it when it gets into that northern area? Is it able to propagate other earthquakes into other geological areas? One of those would be the Marlborough Fault system, and there are some pretty active faults in the Marlborough Fault system. We know about the Hope Fault, Clarence, and the Awatiri faults. And so some of us are doing models or making models of how the crust works, and we're trying to investigate how likely it is that Alpine Fault earthquakes could propagate into other areas and trigger other faults to rupture. So that is an active area of scientific research, and in a sense, it provides, if these things happen, it sort of provides a cascade of ongoing hazards after one event. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Rob. So Isaiah has a similar question about the Hikurangi subduction zone, which is, could the Hikurangi subduction zone trigger multiple fault lines like we saw in Kaikoura in 2016? And has this happened in a previous event, and has this previous event put more pressure on the Hikurangi subduction zone? So Kate, your research has looked at both the Kaikoura earthquake event and the Hikurangi subduction scenario. Could an earthquake on the subduction zone trigger multiple faults like we saw in Kaikoura?
It's a definite possibility, yes. We can't tell for sure in the past if there have been multiple other faults rupturing with the subduction zone. I can think of one example. So we do have evidence for a really large subduction zone earthquake beneath Wellington about 850 years ago. Around about the same time, the Wairarapa fault also ruptured. But when I say around about the same time, we have an uncertainty sort of range of about 100 years. So it could have been the next day, could have been the same time, or it could have been 100 years later. We can't tell for sure. What we can see globally, though, is that large subduction earthquakes definitely have triggered other faults. I can think of examples in Alaska in 1964, the Chile, a large earthquake there in 2010 triggered another fault, but that happened at the same time as the earthquake. So that sort of indicates a large subduction earthquake could definitely trigger other faults, but in New Zealand, we don't know for sure if that will happen, but yeah, it's definitely a possibility.
Thanks, Kate. We've had a couple of really great questions on transport routes following an Alpine Fault earthquake. So Claire asked, I saw something recently about the Otira Viaduct being taken out in an Alpine Fault AF8 earthquake. Do we know which roads will receive the most damage? Where are we likely to be cut off in the South Island, and how long for? And related to that, Greg would like to know, with AF8, the road and rail links to the East Coast will most likely be cut off for weeks at a time, weeks at least. This will mean shipping and supplies to the West Coast. Modern ships cannot access our harbours except maybe HMNZS Canterbury. Is anything being done to ready one of our harbours for this emergency role? So Liam, you're the infrastructure guy. What are the likely impacts of an Alpine Fault earthquake to our South Island roads? Are we talking something similar following an Alpine Fault quake? And if the roads are damaged, is there any work being done to look at port alternatives?
Yeah, thanks for that. So for the road question first, yeah, I think we often focus our eyes on bridges as one of the first targets, but sometimes forget about all of the large slopes that surround all our roads. So what we can learn quite a bit from is from the Kaikoura earthquake in terms of what we saw there. So the Kaikoura earthquake, we saw quite a bit of shaking along the coast, clearly a large amount of landslides. There was a number of bridges that had quite significant damage, but actually most of those bridges were in use or could be in use fairly soon after the event. So the bridges are probably not the weakest link in the network. The weakest link in the network is likely the landslides that would develop. And so if we look at the Kaikoura earthquake as an example of one stretch of road, we've got a much larger area that's going to be affected by strong shaking in an Alpine Fault event. And what we expect to see is, depending on what the event brings us, is most of the passes from the east to the west across the Alps will be impacted in that sort of way with large volumes of landslides along those roads. So understanding that that's going to be the case, there has been work to look at of those different links, which is the ones that are going to be the least impacted, and try to identify what would be a strategy to actually start to remove some of those, that volume of landslides, to get that linkage, which is the key linkage really between, from one side of the Alps to the other. And that could be a fair period of time. And again, the Kaikoura Earthquake is a good one to look back at, is how long it took to actually reinstate some of those routes. So could be a fair amount of time that the West Coast is going to be isolated, as Carolina mentioned before, from other parts of the country. So we know that that's going to be a key challenge, is the landslide of the transport system. Therefore, linking to the other side, which is traveling on the ocean. Yes, it's a very topical aspect right now, and there is actually work going on pretty much this week to try to explore how some of those other alternate routes, and we're thinking of air routes and sea routes, could be utilized to bring in the required supply, support, and assistance for the response and the recovery aspects on the West Coast. So there is actually a few different ships that have been identified that are in service across the country that we think could be used at some of those different port locations, and really trying to explore what would be the mechanisms around enabling those to bring kit into those ports, and at the same time how to deal with the potential damage that may occur at those ports themselves. So there's things like liquefaction, shaking damage. Some of those ports are a little bit old and need a bit of work on them. So if they're going to see damage, is there ways you could get around that damage to still enable that? So that's the sort of stuff that's ongoing, to try to understand. We need a multi-pronged approach to how we get material supplies and people into the West Coast to assist following an Alpine Fault event.
Thanks, Liam. So we've also had a few questions about volcanic activity and monitoring in the North Island from Michelle and Penny. So Michelle asks, is the current volcanic activity, volcanic and tectonic activity around Lake Taupo, White Island, and Mount Ruapehu linked to the Hikarangi subduction zone? And does it signify anything about a potential earthquake? And in a similar vein, we had a question from Penny related to some of GeoNet's monitoring equipment in the far north. There is both an earthquake and volcano drum in Omahuta, which I hope I'm saying right, in the far north. I've noticed over the last few weeks that the drums have been much more active than usual. Two cones I'm aware of are Rangiputa and Mount Camel. What are the other volcanic cones that are being monitored, as Omahuta is a fair way from those cones? So I might put this one over to Tom and also Caroline. So Tom, can you explain what we know about the relationship between the subduction zone and our volcanoes? Could a Hikarangi earthquake trigger a volcano or increase its pressure? And what about the activity in the far north? And also to Caroline, perhaps you could explain a little bit more about this monitoring equipment and what it's telling us. So over to you, Tom, first.
Sure thing. Good evening. And can I just say how pleased I am to be talking about volcanoes on a AF8 and Hikarangi public talk. This pleases me immensely. So New Zealand is on a plate boundary, a tectonic plate boundary is the place to start with this. And where we have the Pacific plate subducting underneath the Australian plate in the North Island, that's what gives us our Hikarangi margin. And that process is where those great big earthquakes come from. But also what happens when that plate is subducting down is that it's because it's full of water and other bits and pieces, as it heads down into the Earth's crust, it starts to melt. And what we have is this zone of volcanism that happens through the central part of the North Island. We call it the Taupo volcanic zone. And that's what's happened from when that crust is, or the plate is subducting down and it's starting to melt, and magma's rising up through the Australian crust and creating that line of volcanism. And that's why we have Ruapehu, Tongariro, Taupo, Okataina, Whakaari volcanoes, all in that lovely big line through the central part of the North Island. So it is all connected, and it's all part of New Zealand being this amazing geological extravaganza that we live in. In terms of yes, we've definitely had some enhanced volcanic activity over the last couple of years, but particularly in the last couple of months, where Ruapehu has been in what volcanologists call unrest, where it's got hot and there's been earthquakes underneath it, and it looks like it's there's been a little bit of deformation around the volcano. So that's where you will have seen some of the media reports showing that GNS Science has raised the volcano alert level to 2, which means heightened unrest. And Taupo volcano's also had some earthquakes underneath it too, which probably means there's been a bit of magma moving around or a bit of deformation there. Whether that's really interesting in its own right, and for people like me who love volcanoes, well, me and Liam, I should say, because Liam's also a closet volcanologist, is that it gets quite interesting. But in terms of whether it's something that's going to forecast or give us any indication around a large earthquake on the Hikurangi subduction zone, is we can't make that connection at all. Where it gets interesting is there's quite a lot of science going into whether big earthquakes relatively close to volcanoes can trigger eruptions. There's certainly a lot of thinking that it appears that an earthquake can unsettle a magma chamber, or if a volcano is kind of close to erupting, you have a big earthquake, that might be the thing that allows it to get its act together and erupt, so to speak. I don't mean to trivialize this, it's very serious business. But that's sort of more the relationship that the current science is understanding. Sorry, my screen's just frozen there. I was just looking back at what the other question is. So I guess a Hikurangi earthquake, if it were to occur, one of the things that volcanologists in New Zealand would be worried about is what does that mean for our volcanoes? So there'd be a lot of close monitoring going on there. In terms of what's happening up in Northland, that's really interesting. I hadn't actually heard that there was more enhanced earthquake activity at all. But Northland's an interesting place where it's got 3 what we call volcanic fields, where the volcanoes up there tend to erupt little batches of basaltic magma, which basaltic magma is really low in silica, so it's really runny, and tends to have, when it erupts, it's not particularly explosive. It's quite these beautiful sort of big fire fountains that can occur, not like what we saw in Tonga a few months ago. So up in Northland, there's 3 volcanic fields up through there, and there's relatively limited monitoring through those volcanoes. Both many of them aren't regarded as being terribly active, although one of them, I think it's the Bay of Islands volcanic field, I think there was thinking that it's some researchers suggesting that it's about 1300 years ago or 1800 years ago there was an eruption. But this might be a good place to hand over to Caroline, who'll be able to tell us a little bit more about some of the monitoring equipment they use for looking at what volcanic activity might be occurring there.
Thanks, Tom. And I love the question because I love earthquake recorders. So the question I think was around what's the difference between the earthquake drum and the volcano drums. They're basically both seismometers. So they're instruments that record tiny vibrations of the ground, and they just come with different sensitivity. So for Tom, and now I know Liam, who's also a volcano expert now, it's important to be able to have those sensors that can record really small vibrations, because those volcanoes tend to be a bit more humble than like an Alpine Fault or a Hikurangi fault. And then we have some sensors that can take a big punch. We put them next to where the likelihood of a large earthquake is increased. So next to Alpine Fault or big active faults, also near urban centers as well, because we know these can shake quite a bit as well. And so those sensors are a bit less sensitive, but they can take a bigger punch. And so they're allowed to get a lot of seismic data without being saturated. Just tell you, I just love those sensors. I actually have one myself in the house right here. And it's kind of like an average one that can tell you when the washing machine is running, but also can pick up, the little 3.9 we had in Parapara Umu. last week, I think. So these days they become quite affordable, and yes, I have one myself, obviously, but you don't need to get one because we have in New Zealand, we have a beautiful national seismic monitoring network called GeoNet. And so GeoNet is really composed of a variety of those seismic sensors for obviously different purpose, whether it be volcano or large earthquakes. And we have more than 500 of those. The data, it's open data. You can just look at it on the GeoNet website. So you don't really need to have one in your house, but yeah, I really encourage you, if you can, to get more sensors. The more, the better. So I just stop here because I could talk for hours.
Thanks, Tom and Caroline. Well, you'll be excited to know that we have another volcano-related question, this time about the South Island from Sid. So he'd like to know, is the Banks Peninsula volcano going to erupt again? And there's a second half to his question, which is when the Alpine Fault goes, how strong will the earthquake be felt here, and how will it feel in comparison to the 2010-2011 quakes that they experienced? So Tom, your chance to talk about South Island volcanoes, and Caroline, maybe you could talk about the shaking experience as well in Christchurch, and how that might, how an Alpine Fault earthquake might feel in comparison to that.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So great question. So on Banks Peninsula, which is very, very close to Christchurch, or part of Christchurch City is actually built on Banks Peninsula. It's a series of 3 or 4 old volcanoes, which geologists believe are extinct. What we mean by extinct is that they won't erupt again. So the volcanoes there are around about 11 to 6 million years old, and very much stopped erupting 6 million years ago. What's interesting about them, and especially during the Canterbury earthquake sequence, is there's these hot springs that are present throughout the Banks Peninsula. And so when we had the Canterbury earthquake sequence, it energized some of those springs, and there was increased hot water flow coming out of many of them, which was easy to assume that maybe there was some renewed volcanic activity. But what those hot springs are driven by is actually connections down to the geothermal gradient underneath the Canterbury Plains, and it's fault-related fluids that are coming back up and being present at the surface, and not magmatic related or anything to do with magma there. So unfortunately for people like me, Christchurch doesn't have active volcanoes. They're very much extinct as far as we can tell.
Thanks, Tom. I'll jump to the next question, which I think was about ground shaking and also how it would be experienced in Christchurch specifically. So from the Alpine Fault. So ground shaking is really controlled, by how big is the earthquake, so the magnitude of the earthquake, but it's also controlled by how close you are to that earthquake, to the fault. And there's another factor, which is how soft the ground you're standing on is. So this is called the site amplification. And we have Liam here is an expert. And so these are the 3 factors. For the Alpine Fault, so back to Christchurch. Christchurch is about 100 kilometers away from the Alpine Fault, at least 100 kilometers away. And so we would expect a moderate level of shaking if we were accounting for the presence of the Canterbury Plains. So unfortunately, the plains will add a lot of amplification to the ground shaking experienced in Christchurch. And and so to just relate back to what the Canterbury earthquake sequence was, this would be, in part of the region, this would be similar to what's been experienced in the Darfield earthquake. Now, I just forgot to say, one main difference would be because of the sheer size of the Alpine Fault, so we're talking 500 kilometer long fault, the rupture, so how long the rupture takes to unzip would be at least 3 minutes. So this is something that we haven't experienced in modern time in New Zealand yet. This would be an extremely long rupturing of the fault. So this adds to the duration of ground shaking. Now that said, we don't really know what the next magnitude 8+ Alpine Fault will look like. And so about 6 months ago, a team of Victoria scientists and myself told you I loved instruments, we went out to the West Coast and we installed more than 50 of those very sensitive sensors, densely spaced along the fault. And the idea was to listen, so not to volcanoes, sorry, but to listen to tiny earthquakes on the fault, because the fault looks quiet, but it's humming in the background. And we're really trying to listen to the Alpine Fault to tell us how it's behaving right now, in order to predict how it's going to behave in the next earthquake. So there's a lot of uncertainty in what the ground shaking will be, and there's just more and more science coming through to better constrain what the next earthquake might be like. So yeah, so I'm going to stop here, otherwise I could talk for a long time again.
No worries. Thanks, Caroline and Tom. So we also have now a great tsunami related question from Shirley. So she asks, how will sea level rise affect our tsunami maps, and is there a plan to update them? So William, this is your area. What are your thoughts on the relationship between sea level rise, tsunamis, and public information? And perhaps Tom as well, with your role at NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, is there a plan to update our tsunami maps?
Okay, so sea level rise certainly can affect how far a tsunami can travel inland, because it's sort of raising the background level. As we have higher sea levels, we can expect tsunamis to travel, to extend a bit further inland. In terms of our maps, it's worth making a distinction here between tsunami evacuation maps and tsunami hazard or land use planning maps. So for tsunami evacuation maps, we're thinking about maps that maybe we'd expect to be, well, prepared to be used in the next 10 to 20 years or so. So we'd only expect a few centimeters of sea level rise over that period. So they're generally developed using current sea levels. Whereas if we're doing land use planning, then we might be thinking about buildings or other infrastructure that we want to be there for 50 or 100 years. And for that kind of work, we would look at different assumptions of sea level rise over that time. Now, because the amount of sea level rise in the next century is not necessarily very well known, we'd usually do a few different levels of sea level rise and compare what the different maps look like and discuss that with the councils who are using it for land use planning. And I'll pass to Tom for the second question.
I thought you're doing a great job, William. Feel free to carry on. So I checked with my National Emergency Management Agency or NEMA colleagues about this, and as William said, with evacuation maps, a lot of the work that's been done to date is probably pretty good for at least in the short term, where we're unlikely to see dramatic sea level change. So the modelling probably holds pretty well, and the current maps that we have are pretty good. But as with everything, our understanding continues to change and get better through time as we better science and better understanding of what occurs. So the way that New Zealand updates it or does its tsunami evacuation maps is that each of the civil defence and emergency management groups around the country are responsible for their own mapping exercises and working and managing their own risks. So NEMA, as the central government agency for this, provides guidance around appropriate ways to do this and recommendations for hopefully nationally consistent approaches. But each of the groups have the autonomy to decide what's best for them. So one of the things that you can do as an individual is engage with that process. When groups are updating their tsunami evacuation zone maps, or what they're looking at in terms of how to participate in some of that decision making, with where evacuation routes might be and what's important to ensure you've got good evacuation pathways and so on, is get in touch with your CDM organisations or offices and participate in that process. And the Bay of Plenty is a really great exemplar of that, where they've got a very people-centric approach to how they're approaching this this challenge. Probably just a final thing to say is it's certainly sea level rise and climate change in general is a massive priority for central government, and there's a huge amount of work that's going on in this space, and it's this is one of the great examples where climate related hazards and challenges really interface with all of the natural hazards that we deal with here in New Zealand. So like tsunami and earthquake and even volcano, managed to weave that in. It's all that multi-hazard interrelated picture is really important when we're thinking about managing our risks. So that's very much front of mind for all of our civil defence and emergency management organisations around the country.
Thank you, Tom and William. We've had a great question related to earthquake early warning systems in relation to the Alpine Fault from Don. So he asks, given that the quake will take a couple of minutes to travel the length of the South Island, is it possible to have a rapid warning system through the civil defence text alerts the moment the quake starts that will give us a minute or so, or even longer for those in Wellington, to move into a safe place to drop cover and hold? I'd have thought there could be some sort of automated connection between the seismic sensors and the text alert system, or is that an impossible dream? Caroline, another chance to talk about
more sensors.
Sensors, yeah. So you've been involved in research exploring earthquake early warning systems. Can you tell us something about the possibility of such system here?
Yeah, so it's not a dream, it's actually already happening overseas. They have operational systems that give people or industry seconds of warning before incoming shaking after an earthquake. So it's not about predicting the earthquake, but it's about predicting incoming ground shaking. So like Japan, Mexico City, California and Taiwan. So yeah, in New Zealand, there's definitely an appetite, as demonstrated by colleagues from Massey University, an appetite for early warning system in New Zealand. And we're very lucky that we can benefit from learning from the successes, but also the failure of those systems overseas. Now, I have to remind everyone that I'm a seismologist, so I'd love it to be just about seismology, but actually an earthquake early warning is about the end users who needs it, and they will define what's the success of that system. And they're really important because they will define the threshold they're interested in, whether they're interested in strong shaking, warning for strong shaking, or warning for, felt level of shaking, or even warning for like shutting down critical infrastructures. So depending on the needs, the system will be quite different. These guys also are really important because we need to have a pretty strong engagement with the end users so that they're aware of the uncertainties around the system, but also the limitations of such systems. And finally, because they will be the one funding it. So we really need, to be like quite transparent and to be aligned with the end users about what we can provide for at what cost. Now, just as an example, so in New Zealand it's happening. We're currently testing 2 different types of early warning systems for two different end users. The first one is our national level. So we're looking at end users such as NEMA, here represented by Tom, or EQC or Fire New Zealand. So these would be the national stakeholders that are really interested in a national level earthquake early warning system. And it would be based on a GeoNet monitoring network. I'll just stop here. And the other one was actually, it's a community-based earthquake early warning system where now the end users is you and I, the people of New Zealand, and so we would be empowering people by hosting a census, and then they would be providing support for the alerts. So this is another research project that is happening with Massey University. So it's a really bubbling topic. It's we're currently testing it, and it's all about cost benefit analysis as well. So I can go and see Tom and say, hey, this is how much it might cost, but actually the benefit would be such and such. So so it's a really exciting field to be in because we have the infrastructures in New Zealand, we have the expertise, we have the appetite. We just need now to discuss, what kind of system should we be implementing. So hopefully I can be invited next year again to this conversation and show you a lot more progress as well.
Awesome, thank you, Caroline. That's exciting stuff. So we have a couple more tsunami related questions, it looks like. This time about the western coastline of Aotearoa. So Tony asks, what are the risks of the west coasts, both the North and South Islands, from a large earthquake on A, the Hikarangi subduction zone, or B, a large quake offshore Fiordland or in the Pusiga Trench? So William, what about our western coastlines? Are they likely to be inundated in a Hikarangi subduction zone earthquake? And what do we know about tsunami risk in terms of our southern plate boundary?
Yeah, so the Hikurangi subduction zone, it's certainly going to affect our east coast much more strongly than our west coast, because it has essentially the North Island between in the way. There are still some risks to the west coast in a Hikurangi subduction zone earthquake. So if some part of the tsunami may find its way through Cook Strait, although we would still expect the waves that manage to make it through to be rather smaller than they are on the east coast, simply because they're having to pass through this narrow aperture. Another possibility is if we have a Hikurangi subduction zone earthquake that ruptures very deep. So the boundary between the two plates, although it's at the surface offshore of the east coast, it actually dips down below the lower North Island and comes, by the time you reach the Manawatu coast, it's maybe about 30 kilometers below. But a really deep rupturing Hikurangi earthquake might cause some deformation of the seabed off of the west coast of the lower North Island. It would still be producing much smaller waves, we would expect, than we would find on the east coast, but it could potentially cause some inundation. And a third possibility is that the Hikurangi subduction zone that we think of sort of going between roughly Cook Strait and East Cape joins on to the Kermadec Trench. And we don't really know, but it's possible, it's unclear, but it could be possible that a large earthquake would carry on from the Hikurangi subduction zone into the Kermadec Trench. And if that rupture does extend along the Kermadec Trench, then we might get some more waves that sort of wrap around the North Cape and find their way back to the west coast of the North and South Island. But all of these things would be giving us a rather smaller, but still present risk to the west coast. With regard to a large quake in Fiordland or the Pusiga Trench, certainly there's a tsunami hazard to the Fiordland area and to Southland. We would expect some waves to make their way up along the west coast of the South Island as well. We have a bit of evidence from that from 2009, when there was a 7.8 quake that caused a small tsunami in Fiordland. But again, those waves would be smaller than in places that are closer to where the earthquake source was. Yeah.
Thanks, William. So the next questions are related to the West Coast as well, a bit of historic tsunami and preparation. So Kevin asked, he'd like to know more about the tsunami risk and tsunami history of Westport and the Buller region. So he says he's reviewed the past history himself after hearing a lot of mixed messages, and the only mention of recent tsunami he could find were in 1868 and 1877, both caused from earthquakes in Chile. And then Catherine's question relates to preparedness for the West Coast in general, particularly following the recent flood and storm events which have impacted the Buller district. So she asks, how well prepared do you really believe we are on the coast? It's predicted we will lose all comms and be geographically isolated. The impact of an Alpine rupture is said to have the whole South Island disruption, also lower North Island. So Kate, what do we know about past tsunami events on the west coast of the South Island? Have there been any more recent events than 1877, and where might a future tsunami come from?
Yeah, I had to look this up myself. I didn't know a lot about the history of tsunamis in Westport. GNS holds a historic tsunami database, which has a sort of a collection of observations of tsunamis from newspapers and instrumental records and so on. So in that database, there's definitely mention of the 1868 and 1877 tsunamis. They were both from really large earthquakes in northern Chile and Peru. They impacted a lot of the New Zealand coastline. The only additional entry that I could see was there was some hints, it wasn't high certainty, but something happened in 1913, I think it was. Yeah, 1913. Might have been a nearby earthquake that looks like it probably caused a disturbance around the river mouth. There's a record there that some boats were knocked around a lot, some campgrounds were flooded near the sea. But yeah, it sounds like that was that followed shortly after a sharp earthquake. So that was probably a small local earthquake generated a small tsunami. There's no records that it caused any damage further away from the shoreline. And the only other records are from sometimes in the 1930s, I think, 1931 and 1939. There were some earthquakes on a subduction zone right up near the Solomon Islands, which produced small tsunamis that impacted Westport. So yeah, it does have a history of tsunamis and nothing significant in historic times. And I'm also not aware of anything from Maori oral histories or anything from geological records that indicate it's been inundated by really large tsunamis. But even, you know, with the amount of infrastructure and people we now have on the coastline, even small tsunamis can be quite damaging.
Thank you, Kate. And so the other part of that question, Caroline, maybe you could touch on. So that was to do with how prepared you think we are on for the coast, and particularly the Bulla district.
Yeah, I guess, you know, preparedness is a funny thing. I mean, we're never going to be 100% prepared for an event of this sort of scale. But I guess one piece of vaguely good news is that an Alpine Fault earthquake of this sort of scale is likely to generate a national declaration of emergency, which essentially means that resources are going to start to come into the most impacted areas. And of course, we're talking there about the Southern Alps areas, you know, communities around the Southern Alps for the most part. So there will be some, you know, we talked about South Island wide impacts. Well, yes, there will be impacts across the South Island, but many of them will be indirect impacts in terms of things like loss of power or communications, things like that. The direct impacts, it'll be felt mostly around the Southern Alps. And so that national declaration of emergency is likely to attract international offers of support as well. And so just like we saw after the Christchurch earthquake, we'll receive offers from our near neighbours, you know, Australia, the US, Japan. There were many nations that came in to support New Zealand during the Christchurch earthquakes, and that's going to happen again if we have this Alpine Fault earthquake. Of course, you know, in any major response to a disaster, there are priorities that need to be thought through, and there are going to be lots of places in need. And so NEMA and the other emergency services and all the agencies that come in to support during a response will be prioritising their effort. And, you know, Bulla is going to be one of the high needs areas, but so will many other parts of the West Coast and other areas around the Southern Alps. And so prioritisation is going to have to start to come along. And I think what this really means for individuals and communities on the West Coast is that we can anticipate needing to look after ourselves for a period of time. And so that really means that as individuals, as whānau, as communities, we need to work on building our resilience and our preparedness well ahead of this event so that we can be prepared to look after ourselves until help comes. Yeah.
Thank you, Caroline, and Kate as well. I just wanted to signpost for everyone who's watching. I know we're sort of reaching the end of our hour, but we've just got a couple more questions to go, so we're just going to roll on through. I hope you can stick with us. So our next question is about liquefaction. So Paula would like to know, where will we see liquefaction following an Alpine Fault or Hikurangi quake? So Liam, what work has been done to understand the potential impacts of liquefaction following these big quakes on the Hikurangi and Alpine Fault? Where would we be most likely to see it? And will it be the same as we saw in Christchurch?
Yeah, so we've had earthquakes that we've had records of in both those areas that are going to be affected. So in the 1931 Hawke's Bay event, there was liquefaction observed in that area. There's also a lot of ground movement occurred as well, which has made things a bit interesting, but we would expect in a Hikurangi subduction earthquake, there would be liquefaction in those areas, probably up into areas around Gisborne and a little bit further afield, again linked to the sort of large earthquake that goes on for a long period of time, that's shaking that's quite intense over a wide area. So we would expect that to occur in a Hikurangi subduction event, and if it was further south, we may expect that to occur in Wellington as well. We may observe some liquefaction similar to damage we saw in the Kaikoura earthquake. Similarly, if you think about the Alpine Fault, same sort of thing. We've had earthquakes in the past there from sort of the 60s back, where there's been observations of liquefaction that's occurred in some of those earthquakes. Those are quite a bit smaller in terms of magnitude, so more localized liquefaction observed. And so we would expect to see similar liquefaction occurring in an Alpine Fault event, again over a larger area. It's sort of an interesting question whether we might see something like the liquefaction that's occurring in Christchurch, but of course, the more intense the shaking is, so closer to the fault, the more likely we would get some soils that might be susceptible to liquefy. And there's a lot of work going on, so all the different councils and regional authorities are doing mapping to understand where is the more susceptible soils, and then based on that can inform sort of current and future planning around investments or assessments for what we have there and what might be built there in the future. So yes, we would expect to observe liquefaction in those future events.
Thank you, Liam. So speaking of impacts and things we need to be prepared for, Kyle has asked a great question. What are your top 3 tips that everyone can do, regardless of their situation, to be better prepared for these big ones? So since we're just about at the end of the session here, perhaps we'll open the floor and see what advice the panel can share to help us be better prepared for these big and sometimes scary events.
I'll just pipe up quickly and say one thing I learned last week is just to have a family plan. Like when an event happens, how are you going to get in touch with your loved ones, particularly if the phone network is down and you have some distance to travel to meet up with them. You really need to think about how you're going to communicate and how you're going to get back together safe at home.
Can I jump in quickly then on what Rob said, and not just have a plan, but also maybe have a bike, because how else are you going to travel distances and get water, food, check on loved ones when the road network is going to be damaged and there won't be any communication system either? So yeah, this was one of my tips, was like actually be bike ready, because that's going to enable communities to be really mobile and just yeah.
Yeah, I might just chip in a bit more on the tsunami side of things as well, in that doing your tsunami hikoi so that you know where your high ground is or how quickly you can move inland away from the coast. But also ask your local school, if you've got school-aged children, ask your school what their plans are for tsunami evacuation, because I think it's really important that we understand that once the ground stops shaking during a major earthquake, it's that get gone, long, strong, get gone message where you want your class of children to move inland and uphill as fast as possible. So ask your school, what have they got in mind for how they're going to do that?
I'll add that it's very good for anyone living near the coast to know their local tsunami evacuation zones. So if you just Google NZ tsunami evacuation zones, it'll take you to the Civil Defence website, and you can use the links there to find your local maps.
My one really builds off William's of know or learn and know your risks. If you know, everybody's context will be different. You'll have different things. Maybe you live by the coast, maybe you live in a mountainous area, maybe you live in liquefiable areas or whatever. But if you've got an understanding of what your potential risks are, then you can take the actions or start to prepare as to how to manage those risks. And I guess it's that sort of knowledge is power. If you know what you're likely to face, you're able to break down those big scary things of what an Alpine Fault or a Hikarangi earthquake might look like, and be able to break it down into bits where you can manage it a bit more easily. And if nothing else, drop, cover and hold in our earthquakes. It's look after yourself and look after your family members. It's the key thing.
I've got another one. Sorry, there's a bit of silence, so I'm just going to jump in. Your home, you can make it as safe as you possibly can by, for example, jumping on the EQC website and learning how to make your house quake ready, fix, fasten and forget, those sorts of key messages, and you can make sure that your house is in the best shape it can be in, so it can be a refuge for you after a big earthquake.
Yeah, I'd also add things about being prepared in different situations. So things like having a bag in the car with sort of shoes in it, a change of clothes, some food and water, having a similar situation at work, like particularly for women, having some sensible shoes at work in case you have to do a really long walk home, that kind of thing. So yeah, definitely preparing your house, but also making sure you've got things that you need in different places as well.
I have nothing more to add. Those are all excellent suggestions. The other suggestion is attend more of these sorts of events, and hopefully we can pass on as much knowledge as we've collected to help you out wherever you are.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everybody. No more last tips to throw in there?
There's a really good website called getready.gov.nz, which brings together all of these tips in really helpful, easy to understand ways, both in English and Te Reo and a number of other languages, and the all super practical tips which are really easy to implement. So check it out.
Awesome, thank you. Heaps of great resources out there. So thank you very much, everyone. Some great advice. And yeah, as well as the Get Ready website, EQC also has a lot, as Caroline mentioned. So there's Quake Safe Your Home. There's also, as well as a booklet that you can read, there's a heap of YouTube videos if you learn better that way. And for local advice and information, and as someone said, it's all about context. So connect with your local civil defence emergency management group via the National Civil Defence website. You can find your local group.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's the big thing is you don't have to do this all alone. You don't have to kind of do it all by yourself, or even do all of those things. They're things that, you know, preparedness actions you can take as a community. So you're not, you know, having to do every single little part of that yourself. So that brings us to the end of our event. We've covered a lot of ground. So a huge thank you to all of our scientists for sharing their time and expertise with us, and to everyone who sent in questions as well, and to the audience who came along, which is awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, and we'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Earthquake Commission, EQC, for making this event and the A Lot on Our Plates campaign that we've been running over the last few weeks possible. We're really grateful. A recording of this event will be available on YouTube and Facebook channels afterwards. For those that couldn't make it, please share it far and wide. Or maybe just if you need to watch it again to take in all the information. There was a lot of information shared here tonight.
And this event was brought to you by AF8 and East Coast Lab. And there is a host of information we're the host of information of around the Alpine Fault and the Hikarangi subduction zone, respectively, on our websites, af8.org.nz and eastcoastlab.org.nz. And remember as well, there's no silly questions when it comes to our natural hazards and to being better prepared. So don't hesitate to get in touch. There's always other ways we can communicate as well. So don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any follow-up questions as well.
Ngā mihi nui, thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Mā te wā.